Okay, hello everyone. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to take you through Stephen Lee's second essay in this chapter about the Nazi economy. This essay is called "How Did Hitler's Economic Policies Relate to His Scheme for Territorial Expansion?" And I'm going to use the notes that I've given to you. So, three parts to this essay. First of all, there's an introduction, then he moves into two different arguments and two different interpretations. But let's just go through the introduction first of all. Okay, so Hitler's economic policy. Stephen Lee starts off by basically saying pretty much by 1928 Hitler had worked out what his economic policy was, and it was written down effectively in Mein Kampf, and then the second unpublished book that he wrote in 1928. The key strands were, first of all, as we know, Hitler wanted to create an autarkic system, self-sufficiency. Okay, very much drawn from Germany's experience in World War One, where Germany had lost the war because they'd been blockaded by the British and starved out. So if Germany is going to wage future wars, needed to be autarkic. Secondly, by 1928, the expansion of Germany's frontiers so that she could basically feed her population would be eastwards. It would be a land-based empire, not a colonial empire. So living space. Thirdly, to do that, obviously, the economy needs to make weapons. Fourthly, an important strand, that the economy needs to maintain living standards of the German people. Why? Because to maintain the living standards of the German people would result in support. And if you're going to win wars, you've got to have high morale. So the economy, therefore, needed to, at the same time as make weapons, it also needed to ensure that living standards did not become depressed. Okay, so it's balancing those two. And then or a fifth priority, and Lee brings this one in. Tooze, of course, wrote his groundbreaking book, The Wages of Destruction in 2006. Tooze argued very convincingly that Hitler had another economic priority, which was a fierce ambition to compete with the United States, and that really, really drove him and gave him a sense of urgency in achieving living space sooner rather than later. He believed that the United States was growing on a year-by-year basis, and that the longer Germany delayed in building up her own economic empire in the East, the chances of ever being able to match the United States and take on the United States ultimately for world domination would be limited. Okay, so that's a key strand from Tooze. Now, effectively, in the next section here, Lee demonstrates that in the early years of the party, 1924 to say about 1927, there was a bit of debate. There was an argument: one, should the Nazi economic policy take seriously the socialist strand, and two, should it? The big question mark: should it continue with the Kaiserreich's approach? If Germany is going to be able to feed itself in the future, to become a sea-based power using colonies. But both of those strands, the socialist approach and the colonies approach, by 1928 Hitler had abandoned those, and instead of the socialist approach, very much moved towards the nationalist approach, and instead of the colonial expansion, land-based, based on eastward expansion. Because one thing, Hitler seriously wanted to avoid a conflict with Britain on the seas. Okay, so pretty much abandoned those approaches, and very much economic policy became nationalist, based on capitalism and expansion of a land-based empire in the East. Now, what Stephen Lee then does is he moves into argument one. Okay, the first of two arguments. So let's just take a look at this. Okay, now this first argument, basically, the historians who follow it, and it's historians such as Klein, whose name we mentioned comes up a little bit later, argues that Hitler's economic policy was very pragmatic. Okay, In other words, it didn't kind of like start off in 1933 with following the idea of total war and preparing for a total war as a consistent approach. What Hitler's economic policy basically did was it responded to the immediate circumstances of the time. It was very, very flexible. Okay, so in a sense, although he was pursuing living space in the East, rather than by a straight line, he was prepared to divert and make compromises and shortcuts and adapt his policy. So a pragmatic approach. So again, we know quite a lot about that, the sort of evidence of that. Think about Schacht's policies, for example. Very much focused on the immediate need to create jobs, to establish wage controls in order to prevent the threat of inflation, and crucially, making those trade agreements with the Balkan states to secure those essential raw materials, paying for them by credits rather than using vital foreign exchange. So the foreign exchange was preserved, so Germany could still buy key goods from other countries that were needed for rearmament. And then, of course, Hitler adapted in 1937. He had tolerated Schacht, but he then moved to the next stage, which was accelerating rearmament and introducing the 4-year plan, autarky, developing ersatz materials, etc. Now, the argument here, which was pursued by the historian Klein, is that these preparations were so successful that what Hitler chose to do in 1937 was pursue a blitzkrieg strategy to expand eastwards. Now, what blitzkrieg is basically it means building up a stockpile of weapons sufficient enough to fight a short, sharp, limited war against one country at a time. So it's based on stockpiling up the military vehicles and weapons to do that. And the historians who developed this argument maintain that the blitzkrieg strategy was as much an economic strategy as a military device. Now, why was it an economic strategy? Because the argument is that by building up enough weapons to fight, let's say, first of all, against Poland, and then defeating Poland, pausing, building up more weapons, so the economy moves into gear to build up more weapons, and then attacking France and defeating France and pausing, it effectively meant that Hitler didn't need, that he could still divert some expenditure to consumer goods. And that was important to Hitler. So effectively, it was a limited degree of rearmament in order to allow a reasonable level of consumer affluence, because popular support and keeping the German people was happy. So it was important to Hitler. That's the sort of key argument there. So in that sense, blitzkrieg was a successful policy, and it reflected the limitation of Germany's rearmament. Okay, effectively that Hitler didn't want to fully rearm, because by fully rearming it would put too many demands on the German people, and that would result in lack of popularity, a decline of morale, all of those conditions that resulted in Germany losing World War I, which Hitler was determined to avoid. The historian Sauer takes it a stage further by saying, effectively, coupled to that was this idea of a plunder economy, that by waging a war against one country at a time in this particular way, effectively, let's say, for example, Germany, didn't even have to go to war, but they absorbed Austria in 1938, and then the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, then, of course, Poland in 1939. Each time Germany's frontiers expanded eastwards using blitzkrieg strategies, the assets of that country could be absorbed into the country, into the German economy, which therefore helped continue the policy of making consumer goods as well as weapons, and preparing for the next stage, pause, develop more weapons, carry on making consumer goods, and then attack the next country. So the argument is the blitzkrieg strategy was remarkably successful up to 1941 because it did succeed in establishing the early stages of living space. But then, in 1941, of course, the regime had to move to a war which put much greater demands on the German people by taking on too much. Germany was at war with the Soviet Union, Britain and the United States. it necessitated the shift to total mobilisation, and that effectively wrecked the previously efficient and successful blitzkrieg strategy, because it showed that the blitzkrieg strategy had masked an inefficient economy. And the German economy simply couldn't cope with the total war. So Germany effectively slid into the same problem in 1941 that Germany had experienced in World War I. By fighting a war on several fronts, she had taken on too much. Okay, so that's the first argument. Let's move on to the second argument. Okay, now the second argument basically places much more emphasis on Hitler moving systematically towards total war from the very, very start. Starts off pretty much the same. Hitler tolerated Schacht's policies because he saw them as essential for the establishment of the infrastructure of autarky. So the Balkan trading networks, in this sense, was the first step in eastward expansion. So this view of this historical interpretation sort of very much sees the sort of like Balkan network as evidence that Hitler was really focused on eastward expansion right from the beginning. Again, these historians would say that the building of the autobahns, etc., was all part of creating that vital infrastructure of autarky. The wage controls under Schacht were all about creating a disciplined workforce that would be more receptive to total war. So in that sense, Schacht's policies of 1934 to 37, but these historians are very much view those policies as clear evidence of preparing for total war. Then, of course, in 1935 there was the economic crisis, full employment, lots of Germans earning money, that increased the demand for food, and Hitler suddenly became aware of the fact that there was a food shortage building up that would affect the whole of the German workforce. And so that kind of like re-highlighted that key point. Germany lost World War I because the population could not be fed. And so what this basically did is it mobilised Hitler to focus much more quickly on total war. So when the 4-year plan was introduced in 1936, it was very much sort of like a sense of urgency. We need to start expanding eastwards to feed our population. So in other words, Hitler was logically gearing the economy to total war at a much earlier stage. Now, the key difference here, in terms of comparing to the first argument, is that Hitler focused on total war. Problems then emerged in the late 1930s that undermined this strategy. And the key problem was Hitler did not want war with Britain and France. That was premature. He did not expect Britain and France to go to war against Germany when Germany attacked Poland in 1939, because the economy was not yet ready for total war against multiple countries. So in this sense, Hitler had to adopt a blitzkrieg military strategy, not because he had planned that, which is what the argument one is, but because he was basically forced to. It was an unplanned response. It effectively sidetracked him away from the what he really wanted, which was to sort of like prepare the economy for a total war. So what the blitzkrieg strategies did is they diverted Germany away from the total war plans. They drained Germany of essential resources. So by the time the war against the Soviet Union and the USA arrived in 1941, effectively blitzkrieg had scuppered the preparations for total war. Interestingly then, quote by Overy there, if war had been postponed until 1943 to 45, sorry, press the wrong one there, if war had been postponed until 1943 to 45, as Hitler had hoped, then Germany would have been much better prepared and would also have developed rockets, intercontinental bombers, perhaps even atomic weapons. Though Britain and France did not know it, declaring war in 1939 prevented Germany from becoming the superpower that Hitler wanted. So according to this interpretation, from the outset in 1933, the achievement of Lebensraum was to be paramount and the German consumer would have to wait. But war broke earlier than expected, which meant that blitzkrieg had to be employed as an alternative to total war, which was to prove a disastrous diversion. Okay, so that's that. I've got to stop there, otherwise YouTube won't take this, but hopefully that was useful for you.